have Dr. Greg Halich here with us. I think I have already made you a co-host, so you should be able to go ahead and share your screen or your presentation whenever you're ready. And Dr. Halich is a Associate Extension Professor at the University of Kentucky with expertise in livestock and forages. And he is going to be talking to us today about bale grazing or feeding hay the easy way. So I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Halich, and let you take it away.
All right, can you hear me okay, Amanda?
Yes, I can hear you and I see your screen, so you should be good.
All right. Let me just do a quick introduction. Amanda, I'm Greg Halich. I'm at the University of Kentucky. I'm originally from upstate New York, so I appreciated seeing Thomas's presentation, the last 2/3 or so of that. And I'm in one of those higher elevation areas in terms of where I'm from, so I can appreciate something like that over corn silage. What I'm going to present today is on bale grazing, and probably most of you kind of know what that is. My hunch is that most of you don't really know what it is in detail, or at least how to do it well here in the Eastern United States. And that's what I'm going to focus on here today. The other thing I'm going to mention is everything that you're seeing here has been real world tested on farm. None of this is, I've worked for the University of Kentucky, but none of this was done on any of our experimental stations. They were done on 2 farms I have, and then with about 5 or 6 other farms that I've been working with the last 6-7 years. So very much farm tested, but I will say the way I do this is very different than maybe if you just do a quick internet search with bale grazing. Probably 3 out of 4 times what will come up will be something kind of in the Great Plains of this country or Canada. So kind of North Dakota to Saskatchewan, Alberta. And it originated there for very good reason, because it works great there. They have frozen soils for probably at least 6 months out of the year in the winter. We don't have that down here in Kentucky. We're lucky to have a couple weeks of time where the soils are frozen. And I'm guessing Maryland and Delaware are very similar to that. So it had to be adapted, had to be changed. And essentially that's what I did for a few years. Probably it took at least 4 years for me to get to the point where I thought it was working well down here and good enough to try working with other farms. So just that as a preface. And let me also say, this typically is challenging for some people in terms of it is a paradigm shift. It's very different from what most people are accustomed to. And because of that, we as farmers are naturally skeptical, and I understand that, and you should be. Anytime you hear something like this, you don't know the full story, you're hearing one side of it, so you want to be skeptical. My only request is that you also have an open mind at the same time. So be skeptical, have an open mind. And the other thing I would say, in case I forget, is if you want to try this, try it at small scale. So maybe do it just for a couple weeks this winter, see how it goes, if it works well for you, because there is a steep learning curve if you don't have someone there guiding you. So that said, we will move into it here. And Amanda, somehow my screen is frozen. This is not good. I'm gonna start sharing screen again. Just hopefully that will take care of it.
Okay, perfect.
And it is not. Even though we practice this at 8:30, it is not. Okay, there we go. I have no idea what was going on there. All right, here we go. So I'm going to just spend about 34 minutes on, maybe why bale grazing is a. Before we talk about bale grazing, I'm going to talk about our alternative feeding methods. So at least here in Kentucky, what you're looking at right now is our most common feeding method. So most people call this a sacrifice area. Some people call it a dry lot. I would say that's a euphemistic type term because, when I took this picture, it actually was dry. But if we get even a 1/4 inch of rain in the winter like that, that's going to be a mud pit. So I think collectively, NRCS, the universities knew that this was probably not the best for, not just farmers, the health of cattle, environment, et cetera. So for very good reasons, we tried to at least encourage farmers to move away from the traditional dry lot. And so probably the first, well, not probably, the first thing that we kind of tried doing collectively is moving to feeding pads. And as with most engineering structures, on paper, they look good. We think that we can put enough, geotextile, gravel, rock, et cetera, to keep them holding up. And I have seen some that hold up very well, right where they're being fed. But the problem then is, cattle aren't going to stay on there the whole winter. They're going to move back and forth. So even on those places that do stay in pretty good shape right around the actual feeder itself, you typically will end up having quite a bit of damage to the access points around there. This is an older feeding pad here in Kentucky. It's not doing a terrible job, but it's certainly probably not doing what it was envisioned to do when it was designed in the engineering stage. Now, you could argue this is an older feeding pad. This is one just built a couple of years ago. I would say it was built about 4 months too early, because the farm here actually saw a presentation I did on Bale Grazing right after it was built, or while it was actually being built. So they actually fed on it 1 year, and I'll show you the result, and they're actually Bale Grazing now. So this cost $12,000. It was for a small herd. So not a great amount of money, but I guess I'd want you to think about what could you have bought for $12,000. And if you think about it in that standpoint, there's a lot that most small cattle farmers could do with that $12,000. Anyway, what I'm going to show you next, this is late fall, probably in early December, right before they started using it. The next picture I'm going to show you is in mid-February. So not quite one, actually, I'm sorry, I think it was late February when I took this, but not quite one full winter of feeding. So this is what it looked like. So I will admit most feeding pads the first year are not going to look that bad. I'm not sure exactly why this one fell apart as quick as it did, but from my experience, it may take 3 years, it may take 4 years, but generally after a few years, pretty much every feeding pad I've ever seen that gets a high amount of use will start falling apart and end up looking something like that. So what else can we do? I'm not going to say it's been a big push the last year and a half or 2 years, but I've seen enough of these that at least I want to mention it here. So compost embedded pack barns are more traditionally seen in the dairy industry, and they work well there for a number of reasons. You've got cattle that need to be inside at least part of the time, a lot more than traditional beef cattle farms. You also have a very much higher value product than with beef cattle. So it works in the dairy industry for very good reasons, but it isn't from an economic standpoint for a beef cattle standpoint. So the cows love it, by the way. And all these cattle they just seem like they actually love being in there. They're dry, they're comfortable, assuming they're not overcrowded, which they weren't here. But in terms of the cost, this actually ended up costing about $150,000. Just the strict profitability aspect of how much it costs, not just the initial cost, but the yearly maintenance costs. You're essentially going to have to get 5 triaxle loads of sawdust a year. You're going to have to stir that with a cultivator or chisel plow twice a day while the cattle are in there during the winter time. It's just very labor intensive, et cetera. So just as another example, this farm that we're actually looking at, their farm insurance went up by almost $2,000 a year after they built this. They completely did not think that would happen. So a lot of hidden costs here. My advice is talk to some people. So if you're thinking about doing that, make sure you talk to some people about it. But I cannot see how it would work for a beef cattle operation, at least cow-calf operation, possibly a backgrounding, finishing potentially. And by the way, the one other thing this does very well, similar to bale grazing or unrolling, is you will get the bulk of the nutrients back in the system because of that deep bed and the carbon that you're bringing in with it. And we'll talk about the other systems related to that later. So what about unrolling hay? We do a fair amount of this here in Kentucky. If I had to guess, it's certainly no more than probably 15–20% at the most, probably less than that. So I do like unrolling compared to, say, a feeding pad or a feeding barn or sacrifice lot, but I'm just going to read you a quote. So this is a farmer in Missouri that saw a webinar last year that I had to do virtually for the Missouri Forage and Grass. Well, it wasn't the Missouri Forage and Grassland Council. It was a regional meeting they did. So 2 things. It's a pretty big farm that they have in Northwest Missouri, and so he said, just kind of like what I was describing in the presentation, that they are happy with the nutrient distribution they get. Actually, you can do a slightly better job if you do a really good job with unrolling than you probably can with bale grazing. But you have a number of problems with unrolling that you won't with bale grazing. First one is, and this is a bigger problem in Kentucky than it would be in Northwest Missouri, when the ground isn't frozen. He's saying that they have, they basically are running up the pastures, driving up and down with a tractor to unroll. And then this is one of those things where, you can't win either way. When it is cold and the ground's frozen, then they have trouble getting tractors started. And this is Northwest Missouri, so it's a little bit colder than it generally gets here in Kentucky, but we certainly have that same issue. Two other things that he didn't mention that are maybe even as big or bigger problems with unrolling, though, are you're going to have a much higher waste rate, even if you do it every day. And certainly if you go from 1 to every 2 days with unrolling, your waste rate kind of goes up very quickly. And what I'm told by people that did is you just generally do never want to go beyond 2 days, or the waste rate is just too high. And then just given the fact that you're out there every day or every 2 days, you're going to be running a tractor a lot. So even on frozen ground, you're still going to have a lot of tractor hours, more so than even just feeding in a sacrifice lot or a feeding pad. So what if we had almost the exact same benefits of unrolling in terms of nutrient distribution, but we could do it without some of those problems and costs that I just mentioned? So something like bale grazing, like I'm showing you a picture right here. And this is on the second farm that I personally started doing bale grazing on. So what it looks like, just if you want to think about a bird's eye view, wherever you're storing hay, and by the way, in the Great Plains, sometimes they will do a late cutting of hay and leave that out in the pasture or hayfield and bale graze it like that. What I found is you definitely don't want to do that in a place like Kentucky or Maryland or Delaware. For a number of reasons. One, that hay will rot considerably during the summer and early fall. It won't rot during the winter appreciably. In fact, it'll be almost impossible to see at that time. But definitely that would be one reason. The other is just here in Kentucky, we have a longer growing season. If you did, say, a second cutting and left it there, then that would preclude you from, say, grazing that in the early fall or so. So here we always have the hay stored, and then we put it out on pasture when we're going to need it, or before we're going to need it. I like to say generally sometime around Thanksgiving to mid-December here in Kentucky. And the reason I just say that is generally we will have dry enough weather during that time period where it's easy to set out a lot of hay efficiently without worrying about wet weather. If it does rain, yeah, you'll have to wait a couple of days, but it usually dries out very quickly at that time of year, again, at least here in Kentucky. So once you have that set up and you're ready to actually feed it, just set up and we're going to start on the side of our water. So here on the right-hand side, put up your temporary fencing, so step-in posts, polywire, polytape. In this example, I have 3 bales that they're going to get access to. That could be 1 bale on another farm. That could be 10 bales on a third farm. So everything I'm saying here is very flexible. So you'll go through that hay before you move that wire. You'll set up the next one, and then take down the first one. Then just slowly work your way across that pasture. Just kind of what we're looking at here. Again, on one farm that may be 2 weeks. On another farm that may be 2 months. And obviously, you don't have to feed all your hay in one pasture. In fact, all the people I work with will have multiple pastures that they'll bale graze in a particular wintertime. So that's what it kind of looks like bird's eye. If you want to see a picture of it, this is one of the first farms I started working with the cow-calf operation. They just set up that cross fence and let the cattle into the section. So they're moving in that direction. The water source actually isn't visible on this picture. It'd be to the right about 150 feet or so. So in other words, they're going to work across the pasture from that direction in the direction of the arrows. All the farms that I personally work with do use hay rings, but I do know a number of farms that I'm not working with directly that don't. In fact, the biggest one that I know personally that is bale grazing, I've read and heard of much larger operations, but the biggest one is in Missouri. They winter about 400 to 500 head each year, and they don't use hay rings mainly because of the reduction in labor by not using them. But what they told me is you definitely don't want to go more than 2 days. You don't want to give the cattle more than 2 days of hay at a time. Otherwise, just kind of like with unrolling, they will waste a whole lot more. So you'll have to make that trade-off. In fact, the farm that we're looking at here experimented for about 3 weeks or so without using rings. And the waste rate, it wasn't terrible, I saw it, but it was high enough where they felt moving the rings more than paid for itself in terms of that reduction in hay loss. Think of your hay as potential nutrients, because that essentially is what they are, and particularly with high fertilizer costs like we're seeing now, and hopefully they don't last very long, but this is even more true in this type of situation. But the reason I highlight potential is because depending on how you feed it, if you feed it certainly in a sacrifice area, or even I'll show you data on a dry lot or a feeding barn, not a compost pack barn, but a feeding barn where you don't have a thick carbon source, you're going to lose most of those nutrients before they're spread back to pasture or hay ground. And we'll look at that data a little bit later on. So the picture we're looking at right here, this is not the same. So the next picture is not the exact same pasture. It's the next pasture. I didn't get back to this farm until about a month after I took this picture. But the next picture was where the cattle were at, and they were just about done in that pasture and fed at about the same density you're looking at right here. And what you're going to see is kind of nutrient distribution of at least just the dung portion of the waste, not the urine. And I think we'd all agree that looks pretty good. It would be hard to duplicate that with a manure spreader, I would guess, at a lot less expense. So if done right, and I will emphasize, you've got to do things right, and it won't always turn out this pretty. But if done right and conditions are good, you can have kind of the same effect as what we're looking at. All right, and one thing that I have found, and really the key to doing this well in the Eastern US, and there are a lot of things that kind of, bullet points that you really want to try to follow. But if there's only one thing that you listen to from my presentation today, would be this right here. What I have found is that to do this well, to not have a lot of pugging in your pastures, you want to feed it at much lower densities than what you see in probably some YouTube videos that are in North Dakota or Alberta or Saskatchewan. And so what I mean there, and so I'll give you 3 different feeding densities, and I put, a lot of times people ask me what distance should I put the bales apart in terms of, from one to the next. And I don't like answering that question directly, because to me, it makes a big difference. Are you feeding 4x4 bales? Or are you feeding 5x6? Obviously, it's going to make a big difference in terms of how far apart you want to put those, depending on the bale size. So I think in terms of tons per acre, and just as reference, I usually think of a decent 5x5 bale being about 1,000 pounds. Yeah, if it's really tight, it can be more than that, but the average 5x5 bale I've dealt with is around 1,000 pounds. So 2 5x5 bales are going to be about a ton. And if you're using 4x5 bales, it won't quite be 3, but maybe 2.6, 2.7 would equal a ton. So I've got 3 different densities. What I highly advise is for you to feed at that low density or even potentially lower. So 2 tons the acre. Again, if we're talking 5x5 bales, that would be only 4 bales to the acre. So not a very low density. But what I want you to look at next is the amount of nutrients that you would be putting back on pasture, even at that low density. And this assumes just 75% of the NP and K can go back on the pasture. We should be able to do better than that, bale grazing or unrolling. But just be conservative. I want to show you the potential amount of nutrients at that level. So even at 2 tons the acre, we're getting over 50 units of nitrogen. We're getting almost 20 units of phosphorus, and we're getting 80 units of potassium. So if you want to convert it to actual fertilizer, that 53 units would be about 110 pounds of urea. That 80 units of potassium would be about 120 units of potash. So I guess the point I'm trying to make, in typical pasture situations, that's a pretty good dose of fertilizer. And if you look at the medium, and particularly the high, yeah, maybe if we're trying to grow corn silage, you could use that kind of fertility. But for most pasture situations, I'd argue we're probably over fertilizing if we're going much above that low level to begin with. The other thing, and I won't talk much about this right now, but I will say, we'll come back to this later on. In addition to just the raw NP and K that you're getting in terms of chemical format, we're getting organic matter in terms of that waste. And again, the same thing would apply for unrolling. And we'll come back to that later, but I'm going to argue that may be as important or more important than just the raw NP and K in terms of chemical form that we're getting. If you're interested in what acre looks like roughly, and these are 4x5 bales on this farm. This farm is very meticulous in terms of trying to do things kind of to the T, and they got about exactly 2 tons of hay to the acre on the other side of where the cattle are right there. This is the biggest hangup I will get from farms, that see the presentation, and for good reason. They're worried that if they try bale grazing, they may mess up their pastures. And I will say it's a legitimate question, because if you do it poorly, if you feed it at say 8 to 10 tons an acre and it gets even remotely wet, yeah, you'll at least here in Kentucky, you will tear up the pastures. There's no doubt. So you've got to do it. You've got to do it well. And I will say, like many other tools, a tool can be, if used well, can do a great job. If used poorly, it can cause a lot of damage. So bale grazing is the same way. So you need to go use it in a method that will work in your area. My guess is Maryland and Delaware would be very, very similar to here in Kentucky. You may have to tweak things just a bit. But I will show you a few pictures here in terms of what some of that damage may look like in different situations. So this farm here just moved the fence. So in other words, they just moved the cattle on the other side of where those step-in posts are right now. And they got about 1.25 inches rain about a day and a half before they moved the cattle. So in other words, the 2 bales that you see right there that were fed out should be obvious, hopefully. They were on those while it was wet. Not the worst rain in the world during the wintertime, but a decent rain. And that's typically the kind of damage you will see in that kind of situation. So it's not terrible damage, but you will have a little bit of damage. There will be pugging around what I call the impact zone, so the area around where the hay ring was, and you will have to learn to live with that. And potentially, I'll show you a few ways to reseed that. But what I want you to also think about it, at 2 tons the acre, 4 bales the acre, we're not talking about a very big area that's even after it rains, it's going to look like that. If I show you a picture just to the left of what we're looking at, where they're also on the same pasture, but where the bales weren't actually fed, it looks like that. So you still see the dung distribution there, not as heavy as it was around the bales, but essentially no pugging in that area. And that's typically, what it's going to look like even when it's wet, just pugging around the rings, but most of the area is still pretty much completely intact. This picture is a drone shot, actually in Virginia. The NRCS state grazing land specialist, JB Daniel, he was interested in bale grazing, and so I kind of worked him just over Zoom basically and phone calls to try to set up a farm that he wanted to do a trial on in Virginia last winter. And so he sent me obviously a number of photos, including this shot here overhead. And what I want to use for this is basically to kind of give you just rough idea of what how much of the area is going to be impacted in that impact zone, like the picture I showed you. So I look at this, and I'm accustomed to looking for that damage. I can see it very quickly, but I'm going to show you a few areas, just highlight that I can look at this overhead picture and show you areas that it was definitely wet when they're feeding those areas. And what I'm going to do now is zoom in on the very left-hand side, the third circle there, and you'll be able to more easily see what I mean there. So you can now see kind of that mud area. And obviously it was wet when they fed there, but if you look at all those other rings, you can see kind of waste hay around there. And I don't know for sure if he used hay rings or not. I'm sure JV told me, but I forget. My guess is, just looking at this, probably he did not use hay rings. So most of those other rings, you can see some hay waste, and I'm sure there's a little bit of pugging around there, but the only serious pugging is where it was really wet, kind of those areas I'm highlighting. And a percentage of the overall bales, you can see it's not that great. It's certainly no more than 20% and probably less. This is on the first farm that I ever started bale grazing on. This is probably 11, 12 years ago now, in terms of how long I've been bale grazing. This picture was taken 3 years ago, I believe, in middle of April, after it started growing up nicely. And this is a picture of a bale that I had bale grazed, fed out that same winter. So, probably in January, February of when I took this picture. So I took a picture a few months after I bale grazed, in other words. And this is probably what the average bale area will look like after I get done at the end of the year. It will have some hay waste in it, a little bit of pugging, a little bit of compaction, but this is probably average. It wasn't muddy, doesn't look bad. that would be about the average. So again, envision about 4 of those per acre. We're not talking about a huge amount of your patch. In fact, it's less than 1%, far less than 1%. So that's what you have there. Now, I do reseed just very quickly with a hand broadcaster at the end of the winter time on both farms. It doesn't take long, takes maybe 2 hours at the most on each farm, and not the whole pasture, just what you see in terms of that impact zone, and a little bit around it, just for good measure. Now, if we look at an area that was bale grazed the previous winter, so right after I took this picture, within 30 seconds, I took another picture of a bale that had been fed out 1 year before that. And what you're looking at, it essentially is that right there. So it healed over very well. And I can look at that picture and I can tell you that it probably wasn't wet when I did bale graze there, because the composition would be a little bit different in terms of what's coming up. So what I'm going to show you now is an area on the second farm, the farm I'm going to show you here in a little more detail, on not the worst bale that was fed out in terms of damage around the impact zone, but certainly in the top 5 of last year on both farms. So the worst one, I didn't get a picture of it, probably because I was embarrassed for whatever reason. But what I'm going to show you next is a picture, not of this impact zone, but a picture of the actual worst, which was about 200 yards or so from this picture. And it's going to be in late June. So after it had about 2 months to grow and recover, if that makes sense. So in other words, think of this a little bit worse. And the next picture is going to be what it looked like after a couple full months of the growing season, after I seeded it down at the end of winter time. And that's what it looked like. So it doesn't look too bad, does it? In fact, I would say I wish I could damage more of my pasture like that each winter. Now, if I zoom in a little bit, it looks better. And what I want to highlight here is the 2 species I found that work extremely well for these impact zones are forage chicory and plantain. And so the forage chicory is kind of the wider forb that you see, and the plantain is a narrower one. And the reason they work so well, I'll show you in this diagram here. So chicory is on the left, plantain's on the right. And if you look at those compared to, say, white clover, a typical cool season grass, and red clover, look at the root systems on those. And it's obvious why chicory and plantain can do so well, as they have deep, strong roots that can break up compaction. And you will have a fair amount of compaction when it's wet, when you're bale grazing. Now, even if I didn't reseed those impact zones, and I know people that don't, but even if I didn't, I wouldn't worry so much about that, because it may take 3-4 years, but certainly by then those impact zones will fill in by themselves, and they'll look just like it would otherwise. What I'm more concerned with is actually the long-term productivity of that pasture with bale grazing versus not bale grazing. And so let me just explain what was going on here to kind of explain the story of why I think bale grazing does so well in the long run. So this was mid-May on the first farm that I bale grazed on, or started bale grazing on. So 5 years into it, and it was early to mid-May when I took this picture. And I was setting up the next break in the pasture for rotational grazing. And I came across a beautiful white circle of what was obviously the best forage in that 2 acres I was giving them. And it was obvious to me that was an area that I bale grazed probably the first or second year on the farm. So in other words, it had 4 or 5 years to recover. And that forage was, most of the forage was 8 to 10 inches in height, and the forage there was 3-4 inches taller and very lush. And in other words, you could still see where that area had been bale grazed very definitively. And so what I did, and I'm sure PETA would not be happy if they heard what I did here, but I basically set up that temporary fence so that they just got a little sliver of that area that had been bale grazed 5 years before, because I wanted to see how close they would come to that, because my hunch was that they would do exactly what we're seeing in this picture. They have 2 full acres of fresh pasture. I just gave them that break 5-10 minutes before I took this picture. And over half the finishing animals share what? They're crowding that fence right in the area that had been bale grazed 4 or 5 years previously. And you can see other steers are actually heading that way. So the cattle are telling me everything I want to know here. The best forage that I have in my pastures are in areas that were bale grazed years ago. It's a long-term, which is a huge benefit. It's not like commercial fertilizer where you're getting a kind of that short-term boost. least from the nitrogen, you're getting a long-term impact here. Now, this is the new farm that I've been bale grazing on. This is the 3rd year. So I'm starting in the 3rd year bale grazing on this farm here. Now, I'm guessing in Maryland, you probably have at least some broom sedge. I don't know how much. Certainly, if I drive through the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, I'll see a lot of that in that area also. But this farm was heavily infested with broom sedge, and I'll just tell you the quick story on this. So, Amanda, am I good? There was something saying that I was muted, or are we still good?
Yes, you're good. Sorry.
Okay. All right. I just want to make sure. So according to my neighbor, my new neighbor here, he was the last person to have cattle on this farm, which was about 25 years ago. And then he didn't get it. A new tenant got it after that and basically hayed this for about 25 years continuously, at least a section of it. There was an area on top that was cropped. But basically this was hayed continuously, and most likely not much was put back given the broom sedge is my guess. So very poor fertility the first year. And this picture here was actually the second last winter. So the second year I bale grazed it. And what you're looking at though, what I want you to, I hope it's shoot, I've got to stop sharing again. For some reason, this is, try that. It's still not working again. There we go. All right. So I'm highlighting basically where it was bale grazed a year before. And so in other words, not this was last year, the year before that, first year I bale grazed, we can see an area that a bale had been fed out. So it didn't completely eradicate the broom sedge, but it did a very good job of starting that process. And I can promise you that area that we're looking at was at least as thick or thicker than anywhere else that you see in that picture. And that's essentially, I was trying to target the highest density areas when I fed that first winter. So my strategy for this farm that we're looking at right here essentially is to bring back the fertility strictly through bale grazing and then just good rotational grazing. And I haven't and I won't put 1 pound of commercial fertilizer on this farm. I'm going to do it all through bale grazing. And again, just good basic rotational grazing. So what I want to show you now is essentially the results after 2 years. And before I get to that, so this picture was the very first year that I bale grazed on this farm. It was end of February. It was a leap year. That's why it's 29th. And due to miscommunication, well, it was partly miscommunication, partly because the sale got delayed. It was during COVID. But basically, this farm was cut for hay one time the summer before, late June, and then nothing was taken off it from that point to the picture that you see. So in other words, what we're looking at is a regrowth from late June all the way through the end of the growing season. And yeah, it's later in the winter. So, you know, it's going to be I shouldn't say tromp down, but just over the winter time, that forage will, from snow and so forth, and kind of get pushed down. But basically you're looking at the forage growth from about half a year on this farm, and you can see how poor it was. So in other words, before I did any bale grazing or anything, that was what it was going to happen on it if it didn't get commercial fertilizer put down. Now, here's basically about 50 feet from where I took that picture. Here's the next one here. So it looks a little better, but you can still, I think we could all agree, it's pretty poor growth for half the growing season. And so what I'm going to do now is just show you 3 pictures after 2 full years of bale grazing and 2 full years of just basic rotational grazing, or really 1.5 years of basic rotational grazing, and to show you what kind of improvement that was made on that farm without using any commercial fertilizer whatsoever. All right, so this first picture is May 9th. So last year, 2021, May 9th. And so on most farms in Kentucky, including for over 10 years now, this picture is completely unremarkable. So by May 9th, I should have forage that looks like that on my other farm, and I will, or even potentially better. But the reason I took this picture, or the reason I'm showing this picture on May 9th, was because it was the closest picture I had to May 6th. In May 6th, in the first year that I grazed this, so after the first year of bale grazing, May 6th was the first day that I was able to graze without any supplemental hay feeding, which was bale grazing on that farm. That's how poor production the spring growth was on that farm. In other words, On a typical farm that's managed well in Kentucky, and including the one I've been bale grazing for 10 years, I will typically start grazing the very beginning of April. And that's not just a little growth where the cows are having to go around, spending all their time to fill up. That's, 6 to 8 inches of growth. I did not have that on this farm until about a month after the typical date that I would be able to turn cattle out on. So that's for reference. In other words, you're seeing more growth on this. Well, let's just say we basically gained about a month of growth on this farm after 2 winters of bale grazing and 1 full year of just good basic rotational grazing. This was last summer, kind of high summer, late July. And you can, no, I didn't have that kind of clover on the entire farm, but I had pretty good either clover or Lesbides growth on pretty much the entire farm. And the year before, again, it was just struggling. There was barely anything there, especially by midsummer. This is taken late October, October 20th. And what I'm going to do next is show you the picture you already saw. And the reason I'm going to show you that picture in that first winter feeding is that both pictures were taken almost from the same spot, about 20 feet away or so. So this growth, basically, that was about 35 days in terms of rotation. So that regrowth was 35 days in the fall versus this picture that you've already seen. That was essentially the cumulative growth from about half the growing season. Again, after it had been hayed for 25 years without any commercial fertilizer put down that summer. So I can't attribute all that, the entire thing, to bale grazing. Certainly part of it was just good rotational grazing, but certainly a good chunk of that was bale grazing. And we'll break that down into potentially 2 ways that you're getting that benefit. So the first, and this is the only good research that has been done on bale grazing that I know of. It was done in Saskatchewan by Paul Youngnitch. And what he did was a very basic just comparison. He basically broke up the cow herd. Half were bale grazed and half were fed in essentially a feeding pad area. And then at the end of the winter time, all the manure was scraped up from that feeding pad, and then that was applied back to pasture with a manure spreader on an equivalent amount of pasture as was bale grazed. In other words, same amount of manure essentially was put down on the bale grazed pasture, and then the pasture that was treated after they cleaned up the manure from the dry lot. I'm going to show you just 2 basic results from that. There's lots of good data that came out of the study in terms of showing nutrient an increase over a couple of years, but I'm going to show you what probably is most important. So the total forage growth, and then the quality of that forage averaged over 2 years. So the first is just raw forage growth in terms of pounds per acre. And so you're going to see 3 different things. No manure was put down, then the dry lot that it was spread on, and then the bale grazed area. So the control had about 2,000 pounds of dry matter per acre, which would be poor for Kentucky or Maryland or Delaware. But again, this is Saskatchewan, Canada, where they get about 12 inches of rain. So I'm assuming that's probably average in that area. I don't know that for sure. And then the dry lot did actually a lot better. It didn't quite increase by 50%, but it came close. And that looks really good until I show you what they got with the bale grazing. They basically more than doubled the production on the bale grazed pasture than they did on the pasture that the manure spread from the dry lot. So my question that I want all of you to think about, and obviously this would be better to do this in person and I can kind of watch people, but I want you to think about how on earth would that be possible? So in other words, same amount of manure was spread on both pastures, the bale grazed pasture and the pasture that the manure spread from the dry lot. But we more than doubled the production on the bale grazing pasture. How on earth could that be? So I want you to think about that a little bit, and we'll start looking into the clues on that. But before I show you that, I want you to show you this next slide, which shows the quality of that growth, protein content. And basically the bale grazing didn't double the protein content, but it came close. And all I can say is I would pay a lot of money for 18% protein hay if I could buy it, which I can't in this area. Now, I will say this. So this was Saskatchewan, so they did feed at very high densities. And I'd have to go back to see, but probably around 10 tons to the acre, maybe even a little bit more than that. So we're not going to get the same response on a per acre base. In other words, let me back up. We're not going to double the production or really triple the production from the control by feeding it 2 tons an acre. We're not going to do that. But we're going to do over more acres than they did, obviously, because we're spreading it to feed at lower densities, we're going to spread over more acres. So we're going to get the same amount of extra growth. We're just going to do it on more acres to get there. So the question I want you to think about, why did bale grazing do so much better? And it comes down to the dynamics of urine versus dung. And it really comes down to dynamics of urine. And this will change, if you have sheep or goats, but for beef cattle, and it will also change slightly by the diet, but a typical forage-based diet of average quality, about 2/3 of the nitrogen is going to come out in the urine for beef cattle. So about 2/3. And almost all, roughly 90% of the potassium is going to come out in the urine. So 2 questions related to that. First one is, what are the most important nutrients for hay production or forage production in pastures? And the answer is nitrogen and potassium. Next question is, how on earth are you going to capture that, whether it's in the feeding pad, sacrifice area, or even feeding barn, unless you have some kind of a carbon source, deep bed like that composted bed pack barn? So the answer is, I don't think there's any way you are. And most farmers, when they start thinking about it, they agree. They kind of nod their heads, even the ones with the feeding pads and feeding barns, that they're just on concrete. They're saying, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to get much of the urine, if any. It's going to, you're just not going to capture that in those kind of situations. And they couldn't prove that in that study, the Saskatchewan study, but that was their guess at why they had that difference, is they're not capturing that urine by doing it in that manner. All right, so they did not look at, so in that study, this is Canadian study, they did not look at soil biological activity, and this is something that's evolving very quickly, and I'm not going to try to claim that I understand the details of it. All I know is that soil biological activity has a lot more impact on forage growth, or even corn and soybean growth, than most people ever realized a few years ago. And so I can't prove it, and no study has been done looking at bale grazing and evaluating soil biological activity. We are going to do some of that in the next few years, though, in a grant that just came through the last couple months. But my hunch is the change in soil biological activity from bale grazing, and the same would be true with unrolling, because you're basically doing the same thing. You're just causing less damage, hopefully, with bale grazing. But my hunch is that probably as much, if maybe not more, that increase in production is coming from the increase or improvements in soil biological activity as are coming from the raw NP and K. And I'll try to tell you a story with the farm that we just talked about related to that. So basically, again, this is also true with unrolling hay, but when you're feeding on pasture, you're getting not just the manure, but you're getting that hay waste. And I would say with manure, there probably is a difference between that manure falling directly on pasture versus sitting there in a pile for months at a time, in terms of what biological activity may be in that manure when it gets put back to pasture in the springtime. I, again, don't know that. No, as far as I know, no studies or research has been done on that, but that would be my hunch. So this is my belief, and we are going to look into this in terms of this as part of the grant that I'll talk about at the very end. But my hunch is that feed waste, both manure and the hay waste from feeding on pasture, whether it's bale grazing or unrolling, is basically kind of priming the pump for that biological activity, which if you're doing on a pasture that has really good soil fertility and biological activity, you're probably not going to have that big of improvement. But on a pasture like I showed you that basically was biologically about dead, that unless it got its dose of urea that spring, it wasn't going to produce. That's where you're going to see that radical increase in production. So again, I'll show you that picture. That was that first winter. And again, well, I didn't mention this, but both winters that I bale grazed on, I basically fed about the same, tons of hay both winters. In the first year, there was a definite, well, it was first year I grazed, so I don't really have anything to compare against. But my guess is it certainly, I did better that first year than if I hadn't bale grazed. But where I saw the biggest improvement was after that second year. And so my hunch is that it probably took a couple of years for that soil biological activity to really kind of prime itself and really start moving. Again, that's just a hunch, and we are going to look into that over the next few years. All right, so I will make the contention that even if I did not get one or any benefit from improved soil fertility and forage production, I would still do bale grazing just because of the benefit we're going to talk about now. And that's that if you do it well, and if you set things up right, you can drastically reduce both your labor and machinery costs over the winter time. I'm just going to show you two farms work with kind of as examples of how that works. This is the first cow-calf farm that I worked with. And this was the third year that they bale grazed. And just like any farm that starts this first year, that you're gonna make mistakes. They made a lot of them, part of the process. Second year, they improved greatly. Second year, they did just about everything right. By the end of the winter time, they were kind of hitting on all cylinders except for one thing. They're basically just setting out one load of hay at a time. And so because of that, well, two things. One is occasionally they're going to set hay out there when conditions aren't good, when it's wet, and they're going to do some damage just getting the hay out to where they want it. But the other thing is, if you're sending hay out kind of piecemeal like that, you're not going to have efficiencies in terms of reduced time per unit of hay that versus if you do a whole bunch and you try to set out 1/3 or 1/2 of your hay at one time, you just won't. There's a big kind of setup costs from just moving hay, getting things set up. So if you can move a lot of hay at one time, especially when conditions are dry or frozen, but I like doing it when it's dry, which makes it a whole lot easier, you can move a lot of hay very efficiently. And this is going to be a perfect example. So that third year, when we're looking at this picture, they finally did this. They set out the bulk of their hay late November. They were probably tired of listening to me or asking, try to set up more of your hay at one time. I don't know, but they finally did it in late November of this third year. They set out 68 bales. So they also had really good stockpile in this farm that third year. And I'll talk more about that later also in terms of relation to bale grazing. But they set out 68 bales. It was mostly 5x6, some 5x5 bales in there, plus pretty good stockpile. It took them just under 4 hours to do that. So two people, one with a loader tractor, one with a pickup truck and trailer. Between two people, they had all those bales set out on pasture right where they're going to be fed in late November. They did not have to have a tractor and did not have a tractor on that farm for over 100 days, from late November into early March. They never had to bring a tractor on that farm. All they had to do is the fence you're seeing there that the cattle just went through. They would move that once every 5 to 7 days, and it would take them just under an hour on average to do that. So roughly every 6 days, it took them about 45 to 60 minutes to move that fence, put out mineral, et cetera. And they never had a tractor on that farm during that time. So that's for just under a 40 cow operation. I think they had 38, 39 cows that winter, but they did everything right. And the caveat is, it will take you a while to kind of get to that point. But once you get there, you can have incredible efficiencies in terms of reducing your labor and particularly your tractor time. This is another farm that I've just been working with a couple of years. This will be the third year, I think, with this farm here. He previously fed and sacrificed a lot. Now, I don't know why he did this, but he said he fed every day in the winter. In other words, he'd put hay every once a day. And he said on average, between when he got out his pickup to when he got back in, it would take about 45 minutes. And typically he would feed for about 90 to 100 days. So now he basically sets his hay out 3 to 4 times a winter. I'm still trying to get him to do that, maybe twice, put half his hay out at a time. He's not quite there. It may take him another winter, but basically he's starting a tractor 3 to 4 times now during the winter versus 90 to 100 times previously. Even if he's 2 days, still 3 or 4 times versus 40 to 45 days. So you can really reduce your tractor time. I say easily by 90% once you get to the point where you're doing things kind of efficiently with bale grazing. Keys are not to set out hay in conditions like this, right? When it's muddy, you're going to be setting out hay piecemeal. Basically probably 2 bales at a time. Versus if it's dry, you can set out wagon loads of hay at a time very easily. And obviously have things set up before it gets bad weather, like the picture we're seeing right there. Those are kind of the two, what I used to consider the 2 primary benefits. So the fertility aspects and then reduction in labor and machinery costs. But there are some other advantages that really are, I originally didn't even think about those until after I'd been working with other farms for a number of years. And it hit me that there's some other big advantages. And the first one we're going to look at actually did take me about 5 years to get to the point where I even saw this potential. So just like with most people, I typically would go through all my pastures in the fall until I was done, then start feeding hay. And it finally hit me one year that why am I doing that? Why don't I set out hay before I run out of that stockpile? And so give you an example, this is that farm I first started working with. This was the first winter they bale grazed. And just like I was first few years, they basically went through all their pastures until everything was grubbed down. And then they started feeding hay. So that's what it looked like that first year. Second year, they did start feeding hay a little bit earlier, and they got a decent stockpile, not great, but a decent stockpile on most of their pastures, kind of like what you see there. And I will, so in other words, all winter, they had a little bit of stockpile and some hay to eat at the same time. And I will contend that if, Maryland, Delaware, like Kentucky, a lot of your hay is not the best quality. So if I had to guess, the hay we're looking at in the background there, that probably at best is 8% protein and maybe a little bit less than that. So mixing in some real good stockpile that we're looking at, even if it's not a lot, but a little bit of 15, 16, 17% protein fescue is going to bump up, even if that's only 25 or 30% of the diet, it's going to bump that up to where the performance does a whole lot better versus if we had grazed for all that earlier in the fall and then just feeding hay during the winter time. This is that third year. And again, they did everything right. They had beautiful stockpile on the bulk of the farm and 2/3 of the farm, like you're looking at. And it was just, like I said, they were firing on all cylinders that third year. So it takes a while to get there, just as with anything, but you will get there if you spend time doing it and trying to improve. And this picture of the first farm that I started bale grazing on, this is just a typical picture of what it's going to look on that farm during the winter. So I try not to actually have too high stockpile, because what I find by the end of the winter time, if that stockpile is too high, they just end up wasting more of it. So I kind of go through my best stockpile early on, and then what I call kind of a half stockpile, have that through if everything works right, and it doesn't always work right. But on that average winter when things work right, I'll have that kind of stockpile all through the winter while they're bale grazing. The other really advantage that and actually I never really saw this with my herd, just because I don't have as many cattle going in the winter. I finished cattle on my farm and didn't really have anything to compare it to. But once I started working with cow-calf producers, this is one thing that every single person that I've personally worked with by the end of that first year would say something like, I just can't believe how clean the coats of those cows stayed all winter long. And after working with a few people and realizing, wow, this is something everyone kind of is noting, it finally clicked on me that, yeah, this is a benefit. And we'll look at a few pictures in terms of maybe understanding that. So this is the new farm that I have. And what I'm showing here, you can see the hay ring on the left-hand side, and you can see mud around it. So obviously it was wet or it rained. Actually, what happened here is we had a fair amount of snow and it just melted here the last couple of days. So it's kind of wet conditions there, but you can see that the cattle are lying down where they're not lying down in the mud. And I'll contend cattle are pretty smart. And if you give them the choice of a number of areas where it's fairly dry versus mud, they're going to generally go where it's dry. And you can see that's what the cattle are doing. But if their only option was mud around there, they're unfortunately going to be in mud. So I'm going to show you 3 different pictures here. This is one of the farms I started working with, I think 3 years ago. This is actually the farm that I showed you, that feeding pad that fell apart that I got to them about 3 months too late. And this picture they sent to me from when they used to feed it in a dry lot, quote, or sacrifice area, I should say. They said by the end of the winter time, it looked like that every single year. So think about the cattle in that environment. And now we'll kind of progress through the different feeding methods. This was the feeding pad that they tried the first year I worked with them. And then this is what they're doing now. They're bale grazing now. They actually bale grazed last winter and they're bale grazing in this winter. So think about those 3 environments and think about which of those are going to be better for the cattle in terms of not having mud, being healthy in general. And now what I want you to think about is not the cows. I want you to think about the calves. Which of those environments are the calves going to do better on? And I think it's going to be obvious to us all that they're going to do better out on pasture like that, where they're being moved. And I think on this farm, they're being moved about every 4 or 5 days. And essentially every 4 or 5 days, they're going to move on to pasture. And this one they haven't talked about, but you don't want to come back and bale graze the same areas that you bale grazed earlier in that winter. In other words, you want to have fresh pasture that has not seen a cow hoof all winter long since early to mid-fall. And if you do that, you will not have mud. This is the farm that I've been working with the longest. This actually is the home farm. The pictures I showed you before were on a farm that was 5 miles from the home farm. That's where they experimented with bale grazing. And once it worked there, they brought it back to the home farm. They actually have a feeding barn on this this farm that's about 250 yards from where we're looking at right now that they have not used for 2 years now. This will be the third year they haven't used it. A beautiful 60 by 80 foot feeding barn. They still use it to wean calves. They've got a working facilities there, so they work cattle and so forth, but they have not fed in it in over 2 winters now, and they probably won't because they say it's just they would much rather bale graze even when it's wet. So in other words, if it's wet, they could bring the cows back to the feeding barn, but they would rather bale graze even in those wet conditions versus the feeding barn. Again, think about those calves there versus the muddy areas. Last thing I'm going to say is I mentioned a grant that just came through. It's NRCS On-Farm Conservation Innovation Grant. There's 6 states involved. So all the way from Missouri down to North Carolina up to upstate New York, where I'm originally from. That's why we included that. I still have friends and contacts up there. But basically, a lot of what I talked about today, kind of with just qualitative assessment, we're gonna try to look at quantitative. In other words, we're going to do a lot of soil sampling, forage testing. We're even going to do a limited amount of microbial testing for that soil biological activity. So hopefully, 5-6 years from now, I'll be maybe potentially be able to do another presentation showing you a little bit more data to back up some of those, again, qualitative assessments that I've gone through with you today. But again, all these have been on-farm, actual real-world examples, and which to me is very important. And the other aspect of what we're doing with this grant, which is even more important than the data we're collecting, is it's called on-farm demos for a reason. The key with this is we're going to be working with other real farms, and with the main objective that these will be places that other farms can go visit after they bale graze. And so they can ask them questions. They can look at, how did it turn out? Was it a disaster? Did they destroy the pastures, et cetera? Because what I found by working with these other farms is those are the best advertisements for bale grazing that I can put together. I can do these presentations, but until most farmers actually go out and see a farm that actually has been implementing bale grazing for 1 or 2 years, that's really when the eyes get wide open and they see the power of bale grazing when done well and done correctly, and that's what gets those conversions over. So just a little plug for that grant, and hopefully we'll have some good data that comes out of this in the next few years. Last question I want to leave you with. So you've seen this picture before, but I also like to leave that question, so I'll let you read it. And then you've got my contact information below if you want to contact me. I think we're going to go through questions now, but if you want to contact me at any point after this, you've got my email and you've got my phone number. So that is it, Amanda. Hopefully we have time for questions.
Yes, we do. Thank you, Dr. Halich, for that presentation. We do have a couple of questions that came through in the chat. The first one is talking about when you were reseeding those areas. I see that you have chicory and plantain shown and mentioned. They have pastures with populations of those species that seem to be invasive. Do you have any comments on that or thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. So the native ones that you have in your pastures will be essentially different varieties. So what I'm seeding are improved chicory and plantain, and the chicory that I seed in particular, I don't have a lot of native plantain to compare what I seed with, but in terms of the chicory, it's like 2 different species. I mean, what I seed is mostly leaf growth versus probably most people think the wild chicory, you see a stem in midsummer, and that's mostly what you see. And that's what I mostly see also from the native chicory. The improved forage chicory, this is seed that you have to buy, obviously. Like I said, it's almost like a different species. It is incredible forage. All I can tell you is when the cattle, that picture I showed you of that worst hay ring from last winter, when the cattle went into that section, which was probably about an acre so that they would get when they went in that section, after the first rotation, after it kind of grew up and they knew it was there, the cattle would be lined up to see who could beat the others to that area. That's how much they love that chicory and plantain in those manners. So no, I love those. And I'm not a beef nutritionist, but I do believe that anytime you have a deep-rooted forage, whether it's a forage like chicory and plantain or something like alfalfa, there are advantages to that just in terms of the minerals that they're bringing up from down below that you may not have in that topsoil. So you're probably getting a lot of micronutrients in that forage that you aren't in the grass and clovers. So for every reason, the cattle love it. All I can tell you is they would race to that area to see who could get there first.
Great, thank you. We also have a forage variety of chicory planted in our sheep pastures, and the sheep do also go for that chicory a lot. So the next question is, have you found soil drainage to be an impact on the bale grazing density? So for example, could you bale graze a more poorly drained soil, or is that just too much potential for mud issues?
Okay, and this is really a good question. It's one of those things where I'd like to incorporate that in the main presentation, but then it turns into a 2-hour presentation. So these are good questions. What I'm saying is because I actually would like to discuss them. So yeah, drainage is a big issue with bale grazing, just like it would be with unrolling. And obviously it works better on well-drained soils. So the picture you're looking at right here in South Central Kentucky is on well-drained soils predominantly. They have parts of the farm that are lower areas that are not poorly drained, but are not well drained also. And I know people that have bale grazed on. So again, I'm from upstate New York. Where I'm from is the very northern end of the Allegheny Plateau. And those soils have a fragipan anywhere from 10 to 20 inches down. So in the wintertime, when it gets wet, it stays wet because that moisture does not go through that fragipan. I mean, it probably does, a centimeter per week or so, but so slowly that you would never notice it. So we have bale grazed on those soils. In fact, the person I learned about bale grazing from was Brett Shedzoy with Cornell Cooperative Extension. He has a little bit better drained soils than we do on the farm in that part of New York. But yes, you've got to be careful, and that's one reason I say bale graze at those low densities. Now, if you have really poorly drained soils on the farm but have some better drain, also what I would recommend is bale grazing those poor drained soils in the fall. So again, we didn't go into detail on this, but I'm a big proponent of bale grazing in the fall before you run out of grass, just so you can slow down the rotation and you can allow more of your pastures to stockpile. That is a great time to bale graze those poor drained soils because in the fall, they're typically going to be very dry. So do that. Or if you've got to do it in the wintertime, you can bale graze there, but what you're going to want to do is have it so that you can get them to 2 different areas very easily. In other words, you can bale graze 2 different pastures, one a better drain, or it may be your feeding pad. And so when it is very wet, you bring the cattle on there. When it dries out or freezes up, bring them back onto the bale grazed area is what I would recommend.
Great, thank you. Another question is, if you are buying ground bales, is there potential to introduce weeds there? And if so, how would you address that?
Yes, there's definitely potential to introduce weeds from anytime you bring hay. I can't say this quantitatively, but qualitatively, I will say that if fertility of the pasture is way more important than the potential weeds. So once you get the fertility of that pasture right, and once I'm convinced part of that is getting the soil biological activity right, and once you do that, the weeds will disappear. So even the weeds that you have, weeds that you may bring in, I don't worry a bit about those. I mean, I do have a really good hay source now, but even if I had some that I had a lot of weeds on, as long as the general quality was good, I wouldn't think twice about it. I wouldn't have a problem bale grazing because yeah, you might get a few more weeds that first year, but if the fertility of your pasture is good, which you're going to get with bale grazing, if the soil biological activity is where it needs to be, which again, if done well, combined with good rotational grazing, you will get with bale grazing, the weeds will disappear. The first year, so the new farm that I showed you, the one that this is the 3rd winter I've been bale grazing on, that first year, I didn't show you pictures the first grazing season, but the first grazing season, the production was obviously poor. But when I would clip that, and I clipped it twice, once in late spring, early summer, and then in late summer, when I clipped those pastures, I was clipping nothing but weeds. I mean, I was, just wondering how on earth am I going to turn this thing around? The pictures I showed you, were not cherry picked. So the 3 pictures I showed you, did you see many weeds in those pictures on that farm the 2nd year? And I'd have to go back, but the answer is no, there were not many weeds. In fact, the second year, there were some areas I would have to get down on my hands and knees really to find weeds that second year. And I can't explain other than I did not spray. I've never sprayed other than some spot spraying on the first farm for honeysuckle, for things like that. I've never sprayed either of the two pastures or the two farms, but I generally do not have weed problems anymore because I'm convinced that once you get the fertility where it needs to be, you get the biological activity where it needs to be, weeds will disappear on their own.
Great, thank you. I think good management goes a long way when it comes to potential weed issues. So this plays right into that. The other question that we have in the chat is, how do you get water to the remote pasture areas in the wintertime? Do you have any thoughts on it?
So again, another really good question, one that I would normally want to address, but just for time's sake, I couldn't do everything I wanted. So water is obviously an issue, just like if you were enrolling hay, same thing, you're going to have a water source. So what I would recommend is start where you do have water and try bale grazing there first. In other words, most of us, the first few years on that first farm, I only had one good water source for bale grazing. And so I basically had to just start there. And once I knew that bale grazing was working, then it was a lot easier to spend, money to start developing that water source. I had good water source for the grazing season, but I did not have good water source the first few years for bale grazing for wintertime. So start where you do have good water sources. Make sure that it's working for you. And once you're comfortable with that, my advice is, then you can start spending some money to improve those winter water sources. That said, I'll say two things. One is cattle can go a whole lot farther distance-wise in the winter to get water than you want them to go in the summertime. The first few years we were having cattle in some places walk, well over probably close to 2,000 feet on some of the farther pastures to get water. Is that ideal? No, but I would rather do that than overfeed in one area or feed in a dry lot. So we did that for a couple of years, and then we slowly build up our winter water, and that obviously took some time. The other thing I will say is in the wintertime, on most farms, at least in Kentucky, again, I don't spend much time in certainly Western Maryland. I've been through would be similar, but you will have a number of wet weather springs in those areas that you don't in the summertime. That I basically, on both farms, there's one place in both farms that I developed that I use in the wintertime. I just basically set up a siphon. I have temporary water to keep cattle out of those springs so they don't mess up the siphon, and basically have temporary water sources for the wintertime that are spring fed that essentially constantly flow. Yeah, occasionally something will plug up and the water lines will freeze. I'll have to bring them in the basement to thaw. So it's not perfect, but it gives me a whole lot more flexibility to get into some of the spots that I don't have that perfect water source. So be a little bit more, you can be a little more flexible in the wintertime versus what you would want to do in the summer with water.
Great, thank you. We really appreciate you being here with us and sharing all of this information with us today.
I appreciate being here, so thank you for that.